What happens when a respected political commentator sits down for what should be a routine late-night interview, only to discover the host has prepared an ambush that will destroy her reputation on live television? Tonight we dive into the explosive confrontation between Nicolle Wallace and Stephen Colbert that ended with security escorting her off the set. This is a story about media manipulation, personal vendettas, and the moment when professional courtesy died on national TV. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, because this story gets darker with every revelation. The Late Show studios buzzed with their usual pre-tape energy. Nicolle Wallace sat in the green leather guest chair, adjusting her blazer as makeup artists made final touches. She had done this dance hundreds of times, appearing on talk shows to discuss politics with the measured expertise that made her one of television's most trusted voices. Tonight felt different, though. The production assistants seemed more tense than usual, whispering among themselves and avoiding eye contact. Stephen Colbert emerged from behind the iconic desk, his trademark grin stretching across his face as he approached for the customary pre-interview chat. But something in his eyes was cold, calculating. The warmth that viewers associated with his public persona was nowhere to be found. "Nicolle, so good to have you back," Colbert said, his voice carrying an undertone she couldn't quite place. "We have some really interesting topics to cover tonight." Wallace smiled politely, sensing the shift in atmosphere but maintaining her professionalism. "Always a pleasure, Stephen. I saw your notes mention the infrastructure bill and the upcoming midterms." Colbert's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "Oh, we'll get to those, but I think our audience would be more interested in some other developments, some more personal revelations that have come to light." The veteran journalist felt her stomach tighten. Personal revelations, that was talk show code for ambush journalism. She had been in this business long enough to recognize when someone was setting a trap. But she was already mic'd up, cameras were rolling, and backing out now would create an even bigger story. "Stephen, if there's something specific you want to discuss, perhaps we should address it now before we go live," Wallace said, her voice steady but her guard rising. Colbert waved dismissively, already walking back toward his desk. "Oh no, I think our conversation will be much more authentic if we let it unfold naturally." "Don't you think authenticity is important in journalism, Nicolle?" The question hung in the air like a threat. Wallace had covered politics long enough to know when someone was playing games, and Colbert was definitely playing games. She watched him adjust his tie and signaled to the production crew with practiced ease, but there was something predatory in his movements tonight. The show's announcer began his introduction, and Wallace forced herself to settle into the familiar rhythm of television performance. She had handled hostile interviews before, survived contentious political debates, and maintained her composure through countless challenging moments on air. Whatever Colbert had planned, she would weather it with the dignity and professionalism that had defined her career. But as the opening credits rolled and Colbert turned to face her with that unsettling smile, Wallace realized she might have underestimated just how far her host was willing to go. The audience applauded enthusiastically, completely unaware that they were about to witness something that would fundamentally change how late-night television handled political guests. "Welcome back to The Late Show. I'm Stephen Colbert," he began, his voice carrying that familiar cadence that had charmed audiences for years. "Tonight we're joined by MSNBC host and former White House Communications Director Nicolle Wallace." "Nicolle, thank you for being here." Wallace nodded graciously, her media training kicking in automatically. "Thanks for having me, Stephen. Always. Good to be back." But Colbert's next words shattered any pretense of a normal interview. "Before we talk politics, I think our audience deserves to know about your recent private meeting with certain individuals who have been quite critical of this show and its approach to political commentary." The statement hit Wallace like a physical blow. She felt her face flush as she processed what had just happened. Colbert had opened with an accusation, not a question, and he had done it in front of a live studio audience who had no context for what he was implying. "I'm sorry, Stephen, but I'm not sure what meeting you're referring to," Wallace replied, her voice carefully controlled, despite the adrenaline now coursing through her system. Colbert leaned forward, his expression shifting from fake warmth to barely concealed aggression. "Oh, I think you know exactly what meeting I'm talking about. The one where you discussed strategies for undermining the credibility of certain late-night hosts who refused to play ball with your political agenda." The accusation was so outrageous, so completely fabricated, that Wallace felt momentarily speechless. In her decades of journalism, she had never encountered such blatant ambush tactics from someone she had considered a colleague, if not a friend. The audience sensed something was wrong, their earlier enthusiasm replaced by uncomfortable murmurs. "Stephen, I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about," Wallace said, her professional composure beginning to crack. "I think there's been some serious miscommunication here." "Miscommunication," Colbert repeated, drawing out each syllable like he was savoring the taste of her denial. "Is that what we're calling coordinated attacks on media personalities who don't toe your party line?" Wallace realized with growing horror that Colbert wasn't just hostile. He was completely unhinged. Whatever information he thought he had, whatever grudge he was nursing, he had decided to weaponize his platform against her in the most public way possible. The studio lights felt blindingly hot, and she could feel sweat beginning to form despite the air conditioning. "I need you to be very specific about what you're accusing me of," Wallace said, her voice hardening as her journalist instincts finally kicked in. "Because what you're suggesting sounds like a serious allegation that you'd better be able to back up." The challenge seemed to energize Colbert. His smile returned, but now it was predatory, dangerous. "Oh, I can back it up, Nicolle. The question is whether you're prepared for what comes next." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the tension between host and guest reached a breaking point. Wallace straightened in her chair, her years of political experience telling her that backing down now would be interpreted as admission of guilt by millions of viewers. "Stephen, I'm going to ask you one more time to either present evidence for these accusations or retract them," Wallace said, her voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence. "Because what you're doing right now is character assassination, and I won't sit here and let you destroy my reputation based on rumors or fabricated stories." Colbert's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Character assassination? That's rich coming from someone who's made a career out of selective reporting and partisan hit jobs. Tell me, Nicolle, when you met with the donors behind the media watchdog groups, did you discuss specific ways to target hosts who weren't sufficiently loyal to your cause?" Wallace felt her heart racing. The specificity of his false accusations was clearly designed to make her look guilty regardless of how she responded. If she denied knowing about donors, he could claim she was lying. If she acknowledged that media watchdog groups existed, he could twist that into confirmation of his conspiracy theory. "I have never, in my entire career, coordinated attacks against any journalist or media personality," Wallace said firmly. "The fact that you would make such accusations without evidence shows either incredible irresponsibility or deliberate malice." "Malice," Colbert repeated, seeming to roll the word around in his mouth. "You know what's malicious? Pretending to be an objective journalist while secretly working to silence voices that don't fit your narrative. You want evidence? Let's talk. About your phone call with Marcus Brennan 3 weeks ago." Wallace's blood ran cold. Marcus Brennan was a former colleague from her White House days, someone she had indeed spoken with recently about completely unrelated matters. The fact that Colbert somehow knew about a private conversation was deeply disturbing, but she realized he was counting on her reaction to validate his story. "My private conversations with former colleagues are none of your business," Wallace replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "And the fact that you're apparently monitoring who I speak with is frankly creepy and unprofessional." Colbert leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying her discomfort. Oh, it becomes my business when... Those conversations involve strategies for damaging the careers of people who won't play along with your political games. Marcus was quite talkative about your little scheme, especially when he realized how it might affect his own reputation. The lie was so elaborate, so convincing in its details, that Wallace began to understand the full scope of what Colbert was doing. He had constructed an entire false narrative, complete with fabricated sources and imaginary evidence, all designed to destroy her credibility on national television. The realization was both terrifying and infuriating. "This is absolutely insane," Wallace said, her composure finally beginning to crack. "You're sitting here making up stories about conversations that never happened, meetings that never took place, and schemes that exist only in your imagination. What is wrong with you?" The audience gasped audibly at her direct challenge. In the polite world of late-night television, guests simply didn't call their hosts liars, especially not with such raw emotion. But Wallace had reached her breaking point, and Colbert seemed to feed off her anger like a predator sensing weakness in its prey. "What's wrong with me?" Colbert asked, his voice rising with mock indignation. "I'm not the one who's been secretly working to undermine independent journalism. I'm not the one who's been using my platform to push partisan propaganda while pretending to be objective. And I'm certainly not the one who's been caught red-handed and is now trying to gaslight the American people." Wallace stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed through the suddenly silent studio. "I will not sit here and be slandered by someone who's clearly lost his mind. This interview is over." But Colbert wasn't finished. As Wallace reached for her microphone to remove it, he continued his assault. "Oh, you're leaving? How convenient. Just like you left your responsibilities as a journalist when you decided to become a political operative. Tell me, Nicolle, how does it feel to know that your own network is starting to question your credibility?" The final accusation stopped Wallace in her tracks. Her own network questioning her credibility. That was a professional death sentence in the world of television journalism. Even if it wasn't true, the mere suggestion planted on national television would follow her for years. She turned back, to face Colbert, her eyes blazing with fury. "You are lying," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You are deliberately, maliciously lying, and you know it. I don't know what personal vendetta you're pursuing here, but I won't let you destroy my career with fabricated stories and imaginary sources." Colbert's smile was triumphant now, as if her anger had proven his point. "Personal vendetta? This isn't personal, Nicolle. This is about accountability. This is about exposing the corruption that's been hiding behind the facade of objective journalism. The American people deserve to know when their trusted news sources are actually political operatives in disguise." The studio audience was completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented and deeply uncomfortable. Several production assistants had appeared at the edges of the stage, clearly unsure whether to intervene or let the confrontation continue. Wallace realized that every word she spoke was being recorded, every reaction captured for posterity and future analysis. Colbert had backed her into a corner where any response would be used against her, where her legitimate anger at his false accusations would be spun as evidence of guilt. "You want to talk about corruption?" Wallace said, her voice shaking with controlled rage. "Let's talk about a talk show host who ambushes guests with fabricated stories, who makes up sources and invents conversations that never happened. Let's talk about someone who's so desperate for ratings that he's willing to destroy people's lives with lies." Colbert's expression darkened at the accusation. For the first time since the interview began, he looked genuinely angry rather than smugly satisfied. "Lies? The only liar here is someone who's been caught and is now scrambling to cover her tracks. You can deny it all you want, but the evidence speaks for itself." "What evidence?" Wallace demanded, her voice rising to match his. "You haven't presented a single piece of actual evidence. No documents, no recordings, no proof of any kind. Just accusations and innuendo designed to make me look guilty of crimes I never committed. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch, with both participants now openly hostile and the studio audience watching in stunned silence. What had started as a routine political interview had devolved into something unprecedented in the history of late-night television, a public destruction of professional relationships and personal reputations. Colbert stood up from behind his desk, matching Wallace's aggressive posture. "You want evidence? How about the fact that 3 different sources have confirmed your involvement in these schemes? How about the documented pattern of your attacks on journalists who don't share your political views? How about your own words, recorded and verified by people who were there?" The claims were so specific, so detailed, that even Wallace began to doubt herself for a moment. Could there be some misunderstanding she wasn't aware of? Some conversation that had been taken out of context? But she quickly dismissed the thought, recognizing it as exactly the kind of self-doubt that Colbert was trying to instill. "I want names," Wallace said firmly. "I want you to identify these sources, produce these recordings, show these documents. Because until you do, you're just a bully with a television show making up stories to attack someone who can't defend herself against lies." The challenge hung in the air between them, and for a moment it seemed like Colbert might actually back down. But instead, his smile returned, colder and more calculating than before, and Wallace realized with growing dread that he had been building toward this moment all along. Colbert's cold smile sent a chill through the studio as he prepared to deliver what he clearly believed would be his killing blow. The audience held its collective breath, sensing that whatever came next would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. "You want names, Nicolle? Fine. Let's start with Sarah Mitchell from the Reynolds Foundation. She was very specific about your proposal to fund negative research on hosts who weren't cooperative with your agenda. Ring any bells?" Wallace felt the world spinning around her. Sarah Mitchell was real, someone she had met at a charity function months ago, but they had discussed nothing more controversial than fundraising for veterans' causes. The fact that Colbert was using real names and real organizations to build his false narrative made his accusations infinitely more dangerous and harder to refute. "Sarah Mitchell and I discussed veteran support programs," Wallace said, her voice barely controlled. "The fact that you're dragging innocent people into your delusional conspiracy theories shows just how far you've fallen. You're not a journalist anymore, Stephen. You're just a man with a grudge and a platform." Colbert's eyes flashed with something dark and personal. "Delusional? Let's see how delusional this sounds. Quote, I think we need to be more strategic about which platforms we engage with. Some of these hosts are becoming problematic for our messaging," unquote. Sound familiar? That's a direct quote from your conversation with Mitchell, recorded on her phone. The specificity of the false quote was masterful in its believability. Wallace realized that Colbert had spent considerable time crafting this attack, creating quotes that sounded like something she might say while being completely fabricated. The audience didn't know it was fake, and many viewers at home would assume that such specific details must be true. That conversation never happened, Wallace said, but she could hear the desperation creeping into her own voice. "You're making up quotes and attributing them to conversations that never took place. This is beyond unethical. It's potentially criminal." Colbert laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the silent studio. "Criminal? The only criminal behavior here is your systematic attempt to manipulate public discourse through backroom deals and coordinated attacks. But please, keep denying everything. It just makes you look more guilty." Wallace realized she was trapped in a nightmare scenario where her denials were being used as evidence against her. Every word she spoke to defend herself was being twisted into proof of her guilt in Colbert's manufactured scandal. She looked around the studio, hoping to see some sign of sanity or support, but found only the uncomfortable faces of crew members who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. "I know what you're doing," Wallace said, her voice gaining strength as clarity dawned. "This entire interview was designed to destroy me. You never intended to discuss politics or policy. You lured me here under false pretenses so you could ambush me with fabricated accusations on live television." For the first time since the interview began, Colbert looked momentarily unsettled by her directness. But he quickly recovered, his predatory smile returning as he prepared for his final assault. "False pretenses? I told you we were going to discuss authenticity in journalism. This is exactly that discussion. The question is whether you're authentic enough to admit what you've been doing, or if you're going to keep lying to America." The word lying hung in the air like an accusation of murder. In the world of professional journalism, calling someone a liar on national television was the equivalent of ending their career. Wallace felt something snap inside her, a lifetime of professional restraint finally reaching its breaking point. "You want to talk about lying?" Wallace said, her voice rising to fill the studio. "Let's talk about how you've spent the last 20 minutes making up stories, fabricating quotes, and creating an entire conspiracy theory out of thin air. Let's talk about how you've perverted your platform to conduct a personal vendetta against someone who considered you a colleague." The audience was completely riveted now, watching what felt like a slow-motion car crash between two media personalities they had trusted and respected. Several people in the front rows looked genuinely distressed by the hostility they were witnessing. Colbert's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation beneath his public persona. "Personal vendetta? This isn't personal. It's professional. It's about exposing the rot that's been eating away at journalism from the inside. You represent everything that's wrong with modern media, the fake objectivity, the hidden agendas, the betrayal of public trust. The only betrayal here is what you've done tonight," Wallace shot back, her voice shaking with fury. "You've betrayed every principle of honest journalism, every standard of professional conduct, every expectation of basic human decency. You are a disgrace to this profession." The personal attack seemed to trigger something primal in Colbert. His face flushed red, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried throughout the silent studio. "A disgrace? I'm not the one who's been secretly working to undermine independent voices. I'm not the one who's been caught red-handed and is now throwing a tantrum because the truth finally came out. You want to know what's disgraceful? Your performance tonight, denying obvious facts and attacking the messenger instead of addressing the message." Wallace had heard enough. The realization that she was dealing with someone who was either completely delusional or deliberately malicious had finally broken through her professional training. She began removing her microphone with sharp, angry movements. "This interview is over," she announced, her voice carrying a finality that cut through Colbert's continued accusations. "I will not sit here and be slandered by someone who has clearly lost touch with reality." But as Wallace stood to leave, Colbert played his final card. "Running away, Nicolle? Just like you ran away from your responsibilities at the White House when things got tough? Just like you're running away from accountability now?" The reference to her time in the Bush administration, delivered with such casual cruelty, was the final straw. Wallace turned back to face Colbert with an expression of pure contempt. "You are pathetic," she said, her words cutting through the studio like a blade. "You're a sad, desperate man who's so threatened by actual journalists that you have to make up stories to tear them down. History will remember this moment, Stephen, and it won't remember you kindly." Colbert stood up from behind his desk, his face twisted with anger. "The only thing history will remember is how you were finally exposed for what you really are: a fraud, a manipulator, and a disgrace to everything journalism is supposed to represent." The confrontation had devolved into pure personal attack, with both participants abandoning any pretense of professional behavior. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, many covering their mouths in shock at what they were witnessing. Wallace began walking toward the exit, but Colbert wasn't finished. "That's right, run away. Run back to your network and tell them how the mean talk show host asked you hard questions. I'm sure they'll be very sympathetic when they see the ratings this generates." The mention of ratings as motivation stopped Wallace cold. She turned back one final time, her voice carrying a quiet intensity that was somehow more frightening than her earlier anger. "You did all of this for ratings," she said, the realization dawning as she spoke. "You destroyed my reputation, traumatized your audience, and perverted your platform, all for ratings. You're not just pathetic, Stephen. You're evil." The word evil seemed to echo through the studio like a gunshot. Security personnel had appeared at the edges of the stage, clearly prepared to intervene if the situation escalated further. Colbert's face was purple with rage as he prepared to deliver one final attack. "Evil? I'll show you evil," he began, but Wallace cut him off with a gesture of pure dismissal. "No," she said simply. "You've said enough. America has seen enough. I'm done here." As Wallace walked toward the exit, Colbert continued shouting after her, his words becoming increasingly incoherent with rage. Security moved to escort her out, not because she was causing trouble, but because the situation had become so toxic that her safety was genuinely in question. The last thing viewers saw before the cameras cut away was Nicolle Wallace walking off the set with her head held high, while Stephen Colbert stood behind his desk screaming accusations at her retreating figure. The audience sat in stunned silence, many wiping away tears, having witnessed the complete destruction of two careers in real time. The credits rolled over the chaos, but the damage was done. In less than 30 minutes, Stephen Colbert had revealed himself to be everything he claimed to oppose. A bully who used his platform to destroy someone based on fabricated evidence and personal malice. And Nicolle Wallace had shown America what real dignity looked like under impossible circumstances. So what do you think drove Stephen Colbert to orchestrate such a calculated attack on a respected journalist? Was it jealousy, ratings desperation, or something even darker? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines.